You'll see from my first slide that I've actually had a change in title since the programme for this was put together, and that's the Head of Planning and Sustainable Development bit, not the Maggie to Margaret bit. And I think that change in job title is actually very significant in terms of the kind of message that we're trying to send out as a City Council by integrating, very proactively integrating planning policy, land use planning policy, also transportation policy, which will hopefully address some of the points that Richard was making about the lack of integration there. Sustainable development policy, which includes issues relating to energy efficiency, and also processing planning applications and building warrants. So we've got an integrated approach all the way through from policy development right through to implementation. What I'm going to do this morning is to provide you with a brief overview of existing and emerging policy at the national level, through the regional level and down to the local level. And I'm sorry that I'm going back up the hierarchy when you were probably expecting me just to talk about what was happening in Aberdeen. But I guessed, and thankfully rightly, that Gavin was going to focus on the building standards issues at a national level, whereas it's actually national planning policy which influences what we do at planning policy level regionally and locally. So I will go back up and then come back down again. I'm also very conscious that really it's the next session that is meant to be talking about putting policy into practice. But I did want to just give a couple of examples where Aberdeen City Council has been putting our money where our mouth is in terms of implementing those policies. So it's showing our commitment and our expectations for others when it comes to implementing the policies that we're talking about. So first of all, what does national planning policy say? National planning policy was articulated through a whole series of planning policy documents, which the government said were statements of their policy on nationally important land use planning matters. And up until February this year, that policy was articulated through individual documents on things like economic development, transportation, sport and recreation, housing, and there was one specifically on renewable energy, which was published in 2007. SPP6, as it was known, included the requirement for all future planning applications proposing development with a total cumulative floor area of more than 5,000 square metres to incorporate on-site zero and low-carbon equipment, contributing at least an extra 15% in CO2 emissions beyond the 2007 building regulations. And then PAN 84, which is Planning Advice Note 84, then told us how we were meant to do that. So that was quite helpful. And I'll come back to how we did that in Aberdeen in a couple of minutes. But I think the important point I want you to note is that at that time, Scottish planning policy was very clear about what was expected of us and how we were expected to deliver that. I think it did raise a whole range of issues about the skills and expertise and the capacity of planning authorities, and particularly development management staff, to actually implement the policy. And I'm saying that not because I don't think that the planners had the intellectual capacity to do it, and I would have to say that because I'm a planner, but more because the Scottish Government were putting more and more expectations on planning officers to be experts in more and more subject areas. And actually, and it's a point that I might come back to later, I think that the right place for this kind of thing is in building standards, probably. They're the people that do have the skills and the experience and the expertise rather than planning officers. Anyway, since February 2010, the old suite of Scottish planning policies was replaced by a single Scottish planning policy document. And whilst the government said that that document doesn't fundamentally change the policy approach, in a manner that's consistent with everything that this government has been doing, what it does was leave much more up to the discretion of local authorities, and it doesn't provide the detailed guidance that we had in SPP6 and PAN 84. The current SNP administration of the Scottish Government set out its central purpose as being to increase sustainable economic growth. And therefore, all its plans, strategies and policies are geared towards implementing that central purpose. And again, as Richard pointed out, when people talk about sustainable development and energy efficiency and all those kinds of things, it tends to be relative to economic development. So the new SPP does say that it does recognise the need to tackle climate change, and in particular to reduce the emissions of the greenhouse gases that contribute to it as a principal challenge of delivering sustainable economic growth. As in SPP6, the new SPP continues to state the important role of planning and supporting the achievement of sustainable development through its influence on things like the location, the design, and the layout of new development. And it reiterates the fact that decision-making in the planning system should, amongst other things, contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions in line with the commitment which is set out in the Climate Change Scotland Act, to reduce emissions by 42% by 2020 and 80% by 2050. It also talks about things like reducing energy consumption and the development of renewable energy generation opportunities, and suggests we should be doing that through a whole range of means, but it doesn't actually give us any detail about how to do that. It talks about things like the orientation and design of buildings, the choice of materials, and the use of low and zero carbon generating technologies. It also supports the generation of the application of medium and smaller sized, smaller scale renewable energy technologies, decentralized energy supplies, those kinds of things. But very significantly, the new SPP removed that very specific requirement that we had in SPP 6 for larger developments to incorporate the zero and low carbon equipment to reduce the CO2 emissions. Rather, it makes reference to Section 72 of the Climate Change Scotland Act, and the need for local development plans to require all new buildings to be designed to avoid a specified and rising proportion of the projected greenhouse gas emissions from their use through the installation and operation of low and zero carbon generating technologies. But it doesn't tell us how to do it. And although it sounds kind of nice and quite easy, it's actually proved quite a challenge for planning authorities to work out what this means and how we're going to do it through the development plan. And again, I'll come back to how we do that when I get down to the City Council level. So what have we done to try and reflect national policy? We've taken action at a number of levels, from the recently approved Aberdeen City and Shire Structure Plan at the regional level, through the local development plan, and then we've provided very specific guidance about our own buildings on the ground. So I'm just going to very briefly touch on what each of them involves. First of all, the Aberdeen City and Shire Structure Plan, done at the regional level, a document produced jointly with our neighbouring council of Aberdeenshire Council and required to be approved by Scottish ministers, which our one was last year. It sets out a very ambitious vision for the future development of the city region over the next 25 to 30 years, very much consistent with the Scottish Government's central purpose of increasing sustainable economic growth. So what it does, it includes allocating land for 72,000 new houses and 255 hectares of employment land, with a view to growing our population by 40,000 people, which is a 9% increase over the next 25 to 30 years. But at the same time as we're doing that, we also have to protect the best aspects of our environment and maintain our high quality of life. And that kind of aspiration is obviously going to require a very careful balance between environmental and economic considerations. And specifically in relation to the theme of today's conference, the structure plan includes an objective to be a city region which takes the lead in reducing the amount of carbon dioxide released into the air, adapts to the effects of climate change, and limits the amount of non-renewable resources it uses. And it sets out targets relating to that, which are for all new buildings to be carbon neutral by 2016, and for the city region's electricity needs to be met from renewable sources by 2020. But a particular challenge for increasing energy efficiency in buildings arises from the house building targets in the structure plan. 72,000 new houses across the northeast, but the decision was made at the time that the structure plan was produced, because of a whole range of economic issues, issues relating to the housing land supply, that we would front load the expectations for that house building development to be done in the first part of the plan period. But what that does is it means that an awful lot of buildings, houses, are expected to be built before the target for being carbon neutral by 2016 kicks in. So what we're doing there is actually adding to the existing buildings that aren't carbon neutral, which probably isn't what the aim of this group is about. I suppose the good news potentially from your point of view is that the current economic climate means that it's unlikely that that development will happen in the front end of the plan period. The bad news is that's not very good for the economy and the development of the northeast of Scotland. So all that sounds very nice, all sounds good, it's all very worthy, but how are we actually going to make it work on the ground? The structure plan says that local development plans and supplementary planning guidance will promote a gradual move towards buildings which are carbon neutral. The difficulty that we have is that our current local plan for Aberdeen City Council was actually adopted before the publication of the structure plan. It's an issue that we've had in terms of trying to get an up-to-date development plan in place for a number of years. So it doesn't actually contain the very specific targets required by the structure plan, by SPP 6 and PAN 84, but it does lend a degree of support to the aims of the structure plan by placing an emphasis on high standards of design, requesting design statements to be prepared, and giving favourable weight to new builds which further the interests of sustainable development.